Last time I mentioned to you the first schools of philosophy in Greece, in ancient Greece, and we started talking about the first, what is considered, who is considered the first philosopher in history, Thales, who thought that the first principle of everything, the first cause, arche in Greek, was water. And there are, many background reasons for even believing that, besides philosophical insight. There are also religious roots about water. It's interesting that water is such an interesting element to be thought of as a first principle. Aristotle mentions a tradition about water. He wrote some think that the ancients who lived long before the present generation and first framed accounts of the gods had a similar view of nature, for they made ocean and Thales the parents of creation, and described the oath of the gods as being by water, which they themselves call Styx, for what is oldest is most honorable, and the most honorable thing is that by which one swears. Tethys was this goddess, the daughter of the earth and Uranus, who was in a sense in charge of the rivers. So in a sense it's like seeing the ocean and the rivers as the parents of all creation. So it's seeing water as what brings life and what makes things happen. It's interesting, this story of the ancient people who thought that even the gods had their oath by water. It's interesting because, even in Christian religion, baptism, which is the sacrament of becoming children of God, being reborn in Christ, is made of water. So water brings with it a strong symbolism. Even before any specific religion, it's easy to see water as the place where we are born in water, of course, when we are in our mother's wombs. And then in the Christian religion, water is the beginning, is the symbolism of the beginning of a new life in Christ. In ancient Greece, already religion had water as a symbol of creation somehow. So it was easy for Thales to think of water, both just looking at nature, looking at something that was common to everything and was a source, a cause of life, and from also his religious background and his culture. But we were not really interested in cultural and religious elements. I was more interested in the logic of his reasoning, in the reason why, not really in the conclusion about water, but the reason why he actually was searching for the cause in the first place. And we focused on movement and the logical background of movement. So how is movement or change or becoming possible? It's possible only if beneath and before change there is something that doesn't change. And since everything is changing, there must be something beneath the change that makes change possible, something that remains the same between A and B in a change. So now let's see what happened after Thales, and not centuries after Thales. All the philosophers we are going to mention today are contemporaries, so they live in the same place. Some of them are disciples of the others. So after Thales, we have another very important philosopher called Anaximander. And he thought that the first principle was something completely different than Thales, but for pretty much the same reason. So he's adding some conceptual element to the idea of this first principle of the arche. He thought that the first principle was the without limits. There is no name really in in English, or even in Italian for that matter. We just use the English term he used. It's called apeiron. Apeiron is it's composed of two particles. In Greek, the first letter, alpha, A, of the alphabet, when it's put at the beginning of a word, indicates privation. So apeiron is a term composed with privation and then limits. So that name indicates the without limit. Not the unlimited, not the infinite, is the without limit, is what is without limits. To understand why Anaximander was thinking of this as the first principle, I think we need, first of all, to really try to focus on our own experience of knowledge and then of the world. When we know something, when we think of something clearly, it's like putting limits around everything else, around a kind of undistinguished whole. Think of focusing on something. You know, let's say you're using a camera and you're watching a television. Well, television, you don't focus on it, but with the camera you do, right? So let's say that at the beginning everything is fuzzy, it's not very well defined, and then you focus. And focusing includes perfect borders around images. So sometimes when you listen to a complicated, class or a new subject, you might be confused. I mean, how do you end that confusion? You start having at least some clear notions in your mind. You try. It's like a clear notion. It's like creating an island in your mind that you can actually use as salvation in the ocean. I mean, at least you can grab that island, and there is something that is clear. That concept is clear. I didn't get anything else in this class, but that concept, that is clear to me. I put some borders around it. So what you do when you paint, right? You have a clear image when you paint it nicely. So, and this is actually deeper than just an image. When we define something, when we define the concept of table or wood or metal, it's like the definition is identifying something, distinguishing it from everything else. So we just see things, we see the world, nature, and then we call something lion. We are defining lion, and defining lion meaning putting something which is around the lion, which makes it different than everything else. So definition is what we would call the essence. So when we talk about things, we talk about what they are, their essences, and their essence is an analogical term. Some people are afraid of terms today. They think that anytime you call something by essence or by nature, you are, using already philosophically charged terms, as if you were already belonging to a specific school of philosophy. We are way before that. I mean, we are using some terms which indicate something we want to refer to. So essence or nature of something at this level just means it's a term that indicates the way we define what they are, and we talk about them as different than everything else. So we say that metal has a different nature than wood because we just call them by different names and we indicate different properties. And these things are borders that we put around them. So these borders create some kind of perfection in our knowledge. Because without borders, without limits, everything is confused, everything is undistinguished. And so in a sense, when you look at the world and you see everything, you see tables and chairs and lights and cameras and people, animals, you see things that are something. They own their limits, their borders. But then you have the movement, then you have change. So clearly change is going beyond these limits, beyond these borders, towards other limits and borders. So somehow, if there is something that is beneath these changes, it's like saying that there is something beneath limits and borders. Something that, because it's not something else, can be everything else. So that's why, following the same kind of reasoning that Thales did, Anaximander thought that the first principle of everything, in order to be the first principle, cannot be anything else. So it's the without essence, without definition, without borders, without limits. It's interesting that for the same reason, Pythagoras and his school, sometimes it's better to talk about the Pythagorean school because we don't really have anything specific about Pythagoras. So they were acting as a very strong, private school, very protective. So sometimes it's hard to say if something actually came from Pythagoras or from another person in his school. But it's interesting that for the Pythagoreans, the numbers could be either perfect or imperfect somehow. And imperfect numbers would be the even ones. You know why? Because they were, as I mentioned to you, they were writing numbers using lines or dots, right? So imagine that you write an even number. So you write 2 dots, right? Then imagine that you write an uneven one. You add the 3rd dot. So the 3rd dot kind of closes the circle, so it creates a limit. While if you leave it open, it's just open to everything. So in a sense, when you have an even number, it was a symbol of something imperfect, because the same reason I'm mentioning right now, because not having limits indicates some kind of vague, imperfect thing. So Anaximander is adding a very insight insight on the first cause of everything, somehow using another term that became more important later with Aristotle. The first principle, in order to, at least as Thales was thinking about it, shouldn't have a form, should be the without form. So the without limit in Anaximander should be the without form in Aristotle. Aristotle thought that these first philosophers were following a very important train of reasoning, but they were focusing mostly on the material cause, which is interesting. Imagine that you are, you're making a statue. So you have a big stone, and then you sculpture the stone, and then you have the statue, right? So in point A, you have a stone without a clear defined shape, at least according to what you have in mind, right? You have a stone, and then you have the statue of a man, right? So somehow, in order to have this movement from just the rough stone to the statue, the defined, polished statue, you need the same thing in point A and B, which is the stone, right? The material is the same, but the shape changed. So somehow and of course, I mean, the stone as it was before and the statue don't share the same form, it's different. So Anaximander is correct in saying that the principle of both doesn't have both forms. So it's the without both limits, right? But it's not the whole picture, it's just one thing. Because when you draw this picture, when you say whatever is water or the without limit or anything else, right? But when you draw this kind of picture, you're saying something really interesting about movement. You're saying that there is something beneath, but you're not adding much more, right? If you want to really explain the process from the rough stone to the statue, that causality, let's call it material causality, it's not the whole picture, the whole thing we need, right? It doesn't explain the whole change. You need to add something more to explain this change. Even these philosophers come before Aristotle's attempt to give a more consistent picture of the kind of causality they were talking about. But they are building this picture in a very rational way. This is what philosophy was about. I mean, it was the invention of a rational approach to nature, which is so new in ancient civilizations, that created in a very short time a very fast development of our minds. And Anaximander had a disciple called Anaximenes. And Anaximenes thought that the first principle of everything was air. You know, we're getting closer to what in many movies is mentioned as the four elements, right? I mean, this is exactly where they come from. And there is one philosopher we are going to talk about later who actually thought that the first principle of everything was actually a multiple principle made of these four elements. But so Anaximenes thought that the first principle was air. Even here, there is an interesting development. Anaximenes, well, first of all, air, if you think about it, among all the elements in nature, is somehow the one that symbolizes that without limits, that without nature. Air, you don't see air. I mean, especially to the ancient minds, air was constantly moving, was so inconsistent. It could be everything else, could be in everything else. And of course, we need air to breathe, to live. So even there, it's easy to see air as the beginning of life and the world. But also air, so air somehow is close to the idea of the apeiron in Anaximander. But air, to Anaximenes' eyes, is also an element that can explain how things change into everything else. So the missing ingredient was precisely how does that happen? So air is constantly moving in Anaximenes' mind. So somehow having an element which is constantly in motion fixes one more missing element in the explanation of movement, because in order to go from A to B, from stone to sculpture, you need things in movement. You cannot just say that the first element is what is without both forms. You have to say also how the movement happens. So you need a dynamism in the first element. So Anaximenes was thinking of putting a dynamism in the first element. And the only element he could see like that was air. And also it was so thin that could be into everything else easily. So it kind of fixed this he's seeing somehow what in Aristotle would become an efficient cause too, the cause that actually pushes things from A to B in a movement. But also he thought of air in another way, which is very interesting. So he thought that air has the process of being more, in a sense, concentrated or less concentrated, condensation, rarefaction. He thought that this property of the air of being, more condensed or condensed or less would be the reason why actually things exist in different ways. Because the question is, if there is one common principle of everything, something that is beneath everything, why are they different? Why aren't they all water? Why aren't they all air? Why aren't they all the same thing? So somehow the first principle should have the property of making things also different, not just equal. So to him, air, if you compress it, becomes one element. If you make it more, rarefacted, it becomes different elements. So in this process, there is enough range to his mind to make everything, in nature, we know in nature. Again, don't focus on the conclusion, focus on the reasoning, because this reasoning is actually grounding pretty much all the science and the philosophy that is coming. All these philosophers were actually very good scientists at that time. They were astronomers and physicists, architects, legislators sometimes, or consultants for legislators. So they are building up what today is a very defined science knowledge for us. So we have at this point, from when we step from Thales to Anaximenes, we have already an idea of a first principle or cause of everything, which is at the same time material, has the potential of having several forms, and which has a dynamism inside. It can actually, it possesses a sort of power to become, not just materially, but also as a power that puts things in motion. So then we have another very important philosopher who is not living in the same city, because these three philosophers are also sometimes known as the Milesians, because they were all, if you remember, they were all in that region called Ionian. They were Ionians, and they were from Miletus, this city in current Turkey. But Heraclitus was from Ephesus, so same region but different city. And Heraclitus had a different idea about the first principle. He thought that the first principle was fire. But this doesn't actually help us much to understand Heraclitus. Most of all, he thought that the first, the real reality is just the change, is becoming, is movement. There is a very famous, we have fragments from Heraclitus, and and we have, what other ancient thinkers or writers told us about him. But one of these fragments goes like this: we descend and do not descend into the same river. We are and are not ourselves. So for him, looking at nature, looking at this becoming everything else, for him the real reality, the real principle was change itself, was the becoming. So he's the philosopher who said that the first principle of everything is becoming, which means that nothing really is. So, we cannot go twice in the same water, because every time there is a difference. And this is, let's go back to that picture, right? To the picture in which, in order to have movement, we have, A and B, right? We go from here to here. But B is not A, right? This is what movement is, that what we have now is not what was before. But it's constantly changing, so you cannot really fix it. Every time, the reality is that now is not, is not, is not, is not. After all, is not is what you really have. You can never say what things really are, because they are changing. When you say this is a table, you're kind of fixing, in a static situation something, which is correct, by the way. If you think of a concept, try to think of the concept you have in your mind. Can the concept of table become something else? No, of course not. Can 2 become 3? Of course not. The idea of 2 doesn't become 3. That's really important. It's not like the idea is changing. No, the idea is what it is. Table is table. Lion is lion. 2 is 2. So when you say 2 plus 1 equals 3, it's not like the concept of 2 and the concept of 1 are becoming something different. It's the concept of 3, which is a product of a different train of reasoning, but that idea doesn't change. This is really an important insight we will develop later on, especially with Pythagoras and Plato. But for the time being, let's just focus on this very fact, that when you focus on reality and you name what things are, you are missing the fact that they are changing. If they are changing, you can never say what they are, because every time they change, they are not, they are not, they are not. So, but if they are not, and being means to fix something in one instant, which doesn't even exist, it means that the reality is just the constant flowing of things. This constant flowing, if you try to see in nature something which looks to you like a constant flowing of something that is never one thing, what would you think of? Heraclitus, I don't know, but Heraclitus thought that fire would be a very good, a picture of it. So fire to him was, what you can see is the perfect nature of this constant changing. You look at fire and its process of becoming is moving into something else constantly. And that's why he thought of fire. So it's not fire that interesting to us as a choice of one of the elements, right? It's important for the reason why he chose fire. He chose fire because he thought that the first principle should be the thing that doesn't that cannot be fixed into any essence. So even here, Heraclitus is close to the idea that the first principle is what Anaximander said, is the without limits. But here he's taking this to an extreme in which this without limits become actually the only thing. And you cannot say what it is because you're missing the point. So it's just the flowing of things. And here, but we are, delaying this discussion to a next class. Here we have one of the two extremes that will characterize this first moment of Greek history between this philosopher Heraclitus, who is reducing everything to not being. Another very important philosopher we're going to touch upon soon, who is Parmenides, who actually took the other extreme. But no, this is for another time. Now, before finishing this class, I just wanted to summarize, thanks to Aristotle, the kind of causalities involved in these physical changes in the world. Keep in mind that this first period of philosophy is being called the naturalistic period because the entire focus is on nature and change and movements in nature. So, and Aristotle tried to distinguish the different causes involved in both his previous, colleagues and, in their thoughts, and also in what he saw in nature himself. So he thought that in order to understand changes in nature, you need to distinguish four causes, not just one. And he distinguished two very important levels of changes in nature. One level he called accidental. So if you look at nature, sometimes you predicate change or becoming in an accidental way, meaning that you predicate a change of something that still is the same thing. For example, you predicate Fulvio di Blasi of a young boy and an adult, right? So young boy here, adult here, Fulvio. So when you call me 2 years old, or 10 years old, or 15 years old, or 18, as I am now, of course, what you are doing is to predicate something about me as a change, which is not really affecting who I am, really. So accidental would be something that doesn't really affect the substance of what I am. So, and this is for most of the things we see: a change in color, a change in size. You get thinner or fatter, you get taller or shorter. Things get bigger or smaller, they change location, they go from one place to another. There would be a change in location, still accidental to what things are. So in this change, what remains the same is the substance you predicate the change of. So if you say that this table was here, now is there, table would be the substance, and here and there would be the accidents. If you say that I was not in very good shape, now in very good shape, so my being in good shape is an accident, and I am the substance, right? But then there are other changes in nature in which these substances change themselves. So again, everything becomes everything else, right? So people die and tables become ashes, and trees becomes different things. Water becomes somehow living organisms. So at this point we have a substantial change, and this is the level in which all the previous philosophers and himself were focusing on at the beginning. So when substance becomes something else, there is a principle that cannot have the form of both substances. We have a substance here, maybe wood, a substance here, which is ashes, whatever it is. I'm not an expert of physical realities, but you need something beneath them which somehow remains the same, which is a material thing. And so beneath the substantial change, what do we have? We have a material cause, what Aristotle called the prime matter, but what Thales called water, and Anaximenes air, and Anaximander apeiron, and Heraclitus fire. whatever it is that remains the same materially. But then we also need what Aristotle called an efficient cause, something that is pushing this movement. So in the case of the change from the stone to the statue, so we have the sculpture, the artist as the efficient cause. So the efficient cause is actually taking, one thing from one place to another, right? And then Aristotle says that we have also the form of A and B, and these forms are somehow causes. Why? Because somehow, if you think about it this way, let's say that the form equal, definition equal what things are. So in a sense, the being lion as a substance, as a nature, is causing the lion to be a lion. So there is something that makes me be what I am, which is the cause of everything else that is going on in me. So when I grow from little embryo to the adult I am now, there is something working me which is not the same that works in a lion from the birth or the conception to the adult lion. Is a different principle that is controlling my entire development. So that kind of form is a cause, and of course is a cause that is also tending towards something, is tending towards an end. So Aristotle would call that the final cause. So Aristotle distinguished famously 4 causes in physical changes: the material form, the material cause, the formal cause, the efficient, and the final. And he distinguished these 2 basic levels of changes in nature: the accidental change, in which the substance is what was behind, what remains the same beneath the changes, and the substantial change, in which substance changes too, and we need the material cause beneath the substance. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.